Should you move properties that are in your own name to a property entity such as a company or a trust? To restructure or not to restructure? Hi, I am Jaco Grobbelaar, the founder and managing director of Prosperity Enterprises. What do you do when you started to build a property portfolio, but you bought the first property or the first few properties in your own name? Do you now move those properties from your own name to a structure, or do you keep those properties in your own name? As a property investor, you want to run your property portfolio like a business. This means that ideally, you do not want these properties in your own name. You want them in an entity of its own, with a bank account of its own, and with financial statements of its own. So, when you have acquired some properties that are now in your name, this might pose some problems. It might be that you are struggling to get financing because of your debt overexposure in your name. Or it might be that these assets are now exposed because of the fact that these properties are not protected with a trust structure. So ideally, you do want to move the properties from your name to an entity. The reasons why you want to build your property portfolio not in your own name but in an entity such as a company with a trust holding the shares are as follows. Number one, you will be able to build a significantly bigger property portfolio when you're not building it in your own name, but you are building it in an entity. Secondly, your tax benefits will be much better. Thirdly, you have asset protection. Your assets are protected, and when something happens to you financially, it becomes very difficult for creditors to get to those assets. And then lastly, you've got the estate planning benefits where your assets are not in your name one day when you pass away, which means that you pay much less costs at death. So, structuring is vital. Structuring is crucial. You need to have your structuring in place, and you need to have your properties outside of your name in an entity of its own. So the correct structuring, as I have mentioned, is where you acquire your properties in a company. But it's very important that that company is not owned by you, but that the shareholder of that company is a holdings trust in order for you to have all the benefits that we've just discussed. You don't want to own property in your own name because of asset exposure and because of debt exposure. And you also don't want to own the properties in a company where you are the shareholder, because in effect, indirectly, these properties are still an asset on your name, which means that it will form part of your deceased estate one day when you pass away, and it could also form part of your assets if you are in financial trouble. So, make sure that you've got the correct structuring in place for your property portfolio. Now, what do you do if you have built a property portfolio and these properties are in your name and not in an entity? One of the things that we can do is we can sell the properties from you to the property company. What are the advantages of doing that? Firstly, is you get the asset out of your name. If the asset is out of your name, it means that it's better protected and it doesn't form part of your estate or your deceased estate one day when you pass away. Secondly, you get the debt out of your name. Now, this is very important because as a property investor, you want to acquire a lot of property and you might need to obtain a lot of debt, but in your own name, that is very often very difficult to do. So by moving the property from your name to the property entity, you are actually moving that debt out of your name, because now you are not going to acquire the debt in your name anymore, but the debt is going to be in the name of the entity, and you may only need to sign surety for that debt. Now, there's a big difference between surety on your name and debt in your name. Debt is an obligation. Surety is a contingent obligation or contingent liability. That means that you only become responsible for that debt should your entity default. And for that reason, it is often possible to build a significantly bigger property portfolio when you do not have so much debt in your name. And then thirdly, you could make a lot of capital available. How do you do that? By selling your property to your property entity is the buyer, you are the seller, and your property entity can apply for financing for that property at market value. So if you have acquired the property at a lower value, or if you have paid off some of the debt on that property, there's actually some equity in this property. And by selling the property to the property entity and the property entity getting new financing at market value, all of that capital, that equity can be paid out to you as the seller. You can then invest it back into your structure and use those funds as reserve funds and also to acquire more property. What are the disadvantages of restructuring, of selling a property from your name to an entity? The disadvantage is mostly costs. When you sell your property to a property entity, there will be transfer costs. There will also be new bond registration costs because you are going to register a new bond in the name of the entity. Then there could also be bond cancellation fees because your existing bond need to be cancelled. In some instances, there could be transfer duties to the tax authorities, and there could also possibly be capital gains tax. Now, when transfer duties and capital gains tax become too much, it starts to make less sense to sell your property from your name to a property entity. We then need to look at alternatives that are more affordable to move the properties out of your name and into an entity. Usually we would look at a transfer, something such as a Section 42 asset for share swap, where the properties would be transferred to the company, and in exchange for that, you will get certain class shares in that entity, and then new shares can be issued to your holdings trust. In this way, you avoid paying transfer duties and also capital gains tax. Should you restructure? When possible, absolutely yes. When you are building your property portfolio, you want it ideally in the right structure and not in your own name. If you like this content and would like to see more of it, remember to like and subscribe.